I'm Harper, 28 years old, and everything changed when my brother Tyler screamed, "You killed her," at our mother's funeral, while 200 mourners watched in stunned silence. The words echoed through St. Matthew's Chapel like a gunshot, cutting through the soft organ music and causing elderly relatives to gasp audibly. I stood frozen at the front pew, my black dress suddenly feeling too tight, my hands trembling as Tyler's face contorted with rage just 3 feet from our mother's casket. Dylan, my other brother, stood silently beside him, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of grief and accusation that somehow felt worse than Tyler's outburst. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how 6 years of sacrifice led to the most devastating moment of my life, and the shocking discovery that changed everything. The accusation shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow it did. For 6 years, ever since Mom's Alzheimer's diagnosis, I had been the only one managing her care while Tyler built his law practice in downtown Chicago and Dylan pursued his photography career in Portland. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October 2018, 3 months after her 67th birthday, when she forgot how to get home from the grocery store she'd shopped at for 20 years. Dad had been gone for 8 years by then, heart attack at 59, and the responsibility of caring for Mom fell entirely on my shoulders, while my brothers continued their lives, as if nothing had changed. Tyler had visited exactly 4 times in those 6 years. 4 times. I knew because I kept track, hoping that maybe the next holiday, the next birthday, the next emergency would finally bring him around. Each visit lasted less than 2 hours, filled with uncomfortable small talk and promises to visit more often that never materialized. He'd walk through Mom's apartment, commenting on how clean I kept it, how well she looked, how lucky we were that her decline was so gradual. Then he'd leave, texting me later about how busy work was, how he'd try to make it back soon, how much he appreciated everything I was doing. Dylan was worse because he pretended to care more. He'd call every few weeks, his voice heavy with artistic sensitivity, asking detailed questions about Mom's condition, her medications, her daily routine. He'd listen with what sounded like genuine concern, making thoughtful suggestions about alternative treatments, holistic approaches, specialized diets that might slow the progression. But when I asked if he could visit, if he could help with even one doctor's appointment, there was always a photography project in development, a gallery showing to prepare for, a creative retreat he couldn't miss. His Instagram was filled with beautiful landscapes from his travels while I spent my weekends sorting Mom's pills and managing her increasing confusion. The financial burden had been crushing from the beginning. Mom's savings lasted about 18 months before I had to start supplementing her care costs with my own money. Tyler made 6 figures at his law firm. Dylan sold his photographs to galleries and magazines, but somehow the responsibility for Mom's $4,800 monthly care facility fees fell entirely on my teacher's salary. I worked summers tutoring, took on freelance curriculum writing projects, even drove for a rideshare service on weekends to make ends meet. My engagement to David ended during Mom's 2nd year at Willowbrook Memory Care, when he finally admitted he couldn't build a future with someone whose entire paycheck disappeared into elder care. The worst part wasn't the money, or the exhaustion, or even the loneliness. It was watching Mom's personality slowly disappear while my brothers lived their lives as if she had already died. She'd ask about Tyler constantly during her lucid moments, wondering when he'd visit next, remembering him as the successful son who would take care of everything. She'd show the nurses photographs of Dylan's latest gallery opening that he'd sent her, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her artistic son living his dreams in Portland. I was just Harper, the daughter who showed up every day, who knew her medication schedule, who held her hand during the terrifying episodes when she forgot where she was. 3 months before Mom died, something changed. She became more agitated, constantly asking about the box she needed to give me, insisting there was something important I needed to know. The nurses assured me this was normal, that patients often became fixated on imaginary tasks or objects as their condition worsened, but Mom's urgency about this mysterious box felt different, more focused than her usual confusion. She'd grab my hand during visits, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail, repeating over and over that I needed to find the box, that everything would make sense once I found it. The funeral planning fell to me, of course. Tyler and Dylan both flew in the day before the service, staying at hotels, offering vague suggestions about flower arrangements and music choices while I handled the actual logistics. They seemed surprised by how many people came, how many lives Mom had touched during her years at Willowbrook, how many staff members attended to pay their respects. I watched them accept condolences from strangers who knew Mom better than they did, listening to stories about her kindness and humor that they'd missed entirely during her final years. Then came Tyler's explosion. standing beside Mom's casket, his lawyer composure finally cracking under what looked like genuine grief. He turned on me with a fury that left the entire chapel silent. The words he screamed about killing her, about putting her away, about not doing enough, echoed everything I'd told myself during the darkest moments of the past 6 years. Every mourner's eyes were on me as I stood there, unable to defend myself, unable to explain 6 years of sacrifice to people who knew nothing about our family's dysfunction. As the chapel emptied and I remained frozen in place, unsure how to move forward after such a public humiliation, Mrs. Thorne, the funeral director, approached me quietly. Her expression was gentle, but urgent, as she leaned close and whispered the words that would change everything I thought I knew about my mother's final months. Your mother left you a video message. She insisted I give it to you only after the service, only when you were alone. The video message would have to wait. First, I had to survive the aftermath of Tyler's public accusation and the seemingly endless receiving line of mourners who looked at me with expressions ranging from pity to judgment. Mrs. Thorne had discreetly handed me a small envelope containing a USB drive, whispering that I should watch it when I was ready, when I had privacy to process whatever Mom had wanted to tell me. I slipped it into my purse and forced myself to stand beside my brothers as people filed past, offering condolences that felt hollow after Tyler's outburst. The receiving line stretched for nearly an hour, filled with faces I recognized from my countless visits to Willowbrook Memory Care. Nurses who had cared for Mom during her worst days, other family members of residents who had become my unlikely support system, the activities coordinator who always made sure Mom had her favorite chocolate pudding. Each person who approached me seemed to pause, uncertain how to navigate the tension that Tyler's accusation had created. Some hugged me tightly, whispering that they knew how much I'd sacrificed. Others simply nodded politely and moved on quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama they'd witnessed. Tyler stood beside me, his face now composed in the professional mask he wore in courtrooms, accepting sympathy as if his emotional breakdown had never happened. Dylan remained mostly silent, occasionally placing his hand on my shoulder in what I suppose was meant to be supportive, but felt more like ownership, as if he were claiming his share of the grieving. Neither of them acknowledged what had just occurred. Neither offered an apology or explanation for the humiliation they'd put me through in front of everyone who had actually known and cared for Mom during her final years. After the service, we gathered at Mom's favorite restaurant for the traditional family meal that I had organized and paid for, just like everything else. The conversation was stilted, filled with forced reminiscences about Mom's better days and careful avoidance of anything related to her care or my role in it. Tyler's wife, Jessica, tried to lighten the mood by talking about their upcoming vacation to Europe, while Dylan showed photos from his latest gallery opening to anyone who would look. I sat quietly, picking at my food, thinking about the USB drive in my purse, and wondering what Mom could possibly have wanted to tell me that she hadn't said during our countless hours together. The real conversation I'd been dreading came later that evening, after the extended family had left and only Tyler, Dylan, and I remained. We met at Mom's apartment, which I'd been maintaining for the past 3 years, even though she'd been living at Willowbrook, unable to let go of the space that still smelled like her perfume and contained 40 years of family memories. The apartment that I'd cleaned every week, that I'd kept exactly as she would have wanted it, that neither of my brothers had visited more than twice since she'd moved to the care facility. Tyler wasted no time getting to his point. "We need to talk about what happened today," he said, settling into Dad's old recliner as if he still lived there. I was emotional, obviously, but the things I said weren't wrong. Mom deteriorated faster than she should have. The facility you chose, the care decisions you made without consulting us, the way you kept us at arm's length during her final months. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Kept you at arm's length?" I repeated, my voice barely controlled. "Tyler, you visited 4 times in 6 years, 4 times. I sent you weekly updates about her condition, invited you to every doctor's appointment, begged you to come see her during the holidays. You were always too busy." Dylan shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his artistic sensibilities apparently disturbed by direct confrontation. "Harper, you have to understand our perspective," he said in the measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "We live far away. We have careers, responsibilities. We trusted you to keep us informed, but sometimes it felt like you were making major decisions without really including us in the process." "What decisions?" I demanded. "Choosing Willowbrook after visiting 12 different facilities, authorizing her medications based on her doctor's recommendations, deciding she needed to move to memory care when she started wandering out of her apartment at night. What exactly should I have done differently?" Tyler leaned forward, his lawyer instincts taking over. "You could have gotten second opinions. You could have explored private care options that might have let her stay in her own home longer. You could have consulted specialists in alternative treatments instead of just accepting what the first neurologist told you. The suggestion that I hadn't done enough research, hadn't fought hard enough for better options, cut deeper than his public accusation at the funeral. For 6 years, I had lived and breathed Alzheimer's research, joining support groups, reading medical journals, consulting with specialists, exploring every possible treatment option that insurance would cover and many that it wouldn't. I'd spent countless nights researching experimental drugs, alternative therapies, specialized diet plans, anything that might slow Mom's decline or improve her quality of life. I researched everything, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. I took her to specialists at Northwestern, got second opinions from 3 different neurologists, tried every medication they recommended. I looked into private care, Tyler. Do you know what it costs? $18,000 a month for quality in-home care. Where exactly was I supposed to get $18,000 a month while you were buying your BMW and Dylan was traveling to photography workshops in Europe? The financial reality of Mom's care had been my constant companion for 6 years. While Tyler paid off his downtown condo and Dylan invested in expensive camera equipment, I had liquidated my savings, canceled my retirement contributions, and worked multiple jobs to bridge the gap between Mom's resources and her actual needs. The irony wasn't lost on me that both my brothers earned significantly more than I did, but had somehow convinced themselves that elder care was exclusively my responsibility because I lived closer and was better with that kind of thing. Dylan's response revealed the depth of their detachment from reality. Maybe if you'd communicated better about the costs, we could have helped, he said. But you never asked for money. You just took everything on yourself and then acted like a martyr about it. I sent you both copies of every bill, I replied, pulling out my phone to scroll through years of unanswered emails. I attached Willowbrook's monthly statements, showed you the projections for her care costs, explained exactly how much I was contributing from my own salary. Tyler, you responded to exactly 3 of those emails in 6 years, and they were all one-sentence acknowledgments. Dylan, you usually just liked the email without responding at all. The evidence was all there in my phone, a digital record of 6 years of one-sided communication. Monthly updates about Mom's condition that received minimal responses, invitations to care plan meetings that were politely declined, financial summaries that were acknowledged but never discussed, holiday suggestions that were met with vague promises to try to make it work, that never materialized into actual visits. What hurt most was their genuine belief that they had been loving, supportive sons who had simply trusted me to handle things. In their minds, my willingness to take on the responsibility had freed them from obligation rather than highlighting their abandonment. They saw my sacrifices as choices I'd made rather than necessities created by their absence. They interpreted my lack of explicit requests for help as proof that I didn't need or want their involvement, rather than evidence of how completely they'd checked out of our family's crisis. As we sat in Mom's living room, surrounded by photos of family gatherings they'd missed and get-well cards they'd never sent, I realized that no amount of evidence would change their perspective. They needed to believe that Mom's decline and death were somehow my fault, because accepting responsibility would mean acknowledging 6 years of willful neglect. It was easier to blame my care decisions than to confront their own absence during the most difficult period of our family's life. The meeting ended with Tyler announcing that he would be handling Mom's estate, as if this were a natural extension of his legal expertise rather than his first meaningful involvement in her affairs since the diagnosis. Dylan nodded his agreement, already planning his return to Portland and his next photography project. Neither seemed interested in the USB drive I'd received from Mrs. Thorne. Neither asked what final arrangements I'd made or what Mom might have wanted them to know. That night, alone in my own apartment for the first time since Mom's death, I finally allowed myself to cry properly. Not the restrained tears of public grief, but the raw, exhausting sobs of someone who had carried an impossible burden alone for 6 years, only to be blamed for its weight. The blame campaign began 3 days after the funeral, starting with a Facebook post from Tyler that appeared on my feed like a digital slap. Sometimes the hardest part of losing a parent isn't the grief itself, but wondering if things could have been different with better advocacy and care coordination, he wrote, accompanied by a photo of Mom from 5 years ago, before the worst of her decline. The post garnered dozens of sympathetic comments from his law firm colleagues and old college friends. People who had never met our mother but felt compelled to offer their support for his difficult loss. I stared at the post for 20 minutes, reading and rereading the carefully crafted language that managed to sound profound while containing a clear accusation. Tyler had always been skilled at using words to create impressions without making statements he could be held accountable for. To anyone who didn't know our family situation, it looked like the thoughtful reflection of a grieving son. To me, it was another public attack on my 6 years of caregiving, wrapped in the kind of professional language he used to discredit witnesses in court. Dylan's response came in the form of phone calls, long, rambling conversations where he positioned himself as the sensitive brother, trying to process complex emotions about our family dynamics. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom's final years," he said during our first post-funeral conversation, his voice heavy with artistic melancholy. "I keep wondering if there were alternative approaches we didn't explore, more holistic methods that might have preserved her dignity better than the clinical environment she ended up in." The suggestion that Willowbrook Memory Care lacked dignity stung particularly deeply because I'd spent months researching facilities, visiting dozens of options, reading reviews and inspection reports, talking to other families about their experiences. Willowbrook wasn't perfect, but it was warm, well-staffed, and specialized in Alzheimer's care in ways that the cheaper alternatives simply weren't. The staff knew Mom's preferences, celebrated her birthday every year, and treated her with genuine kindness even during her most difficult episodes. "What alternative approach?" I asked Dylan, though I already knew the answer would vague suggestions, concrete proposals. "Are you talking about the experimental treatments I read? The ones that cost $40,000 and aren't covered by insurance? The clinical trials she didn't qualify for because of her other medications?" Dylan's response was predictably evasive. "I'm not trying to second-guess your decisions, Harper. I'm just processing my own feelings about whether we as a family could have been more creative, more collaborative in our approach. Sometimes I think the medical establishment pushes families toward institutional solutions when more personalized care might be." The word collaborative was particularly galling given that Dylan had collaborated on exactly nothing during Mom's illness. He'd never attended a care plan meeting, never spoken to her doctor, never researched treatment options or facility alternatives. His collaboration had consisted entirely of phone calls where he offered philosophical observations about elder care while I handled every practical aspect of Mom's daily need. The real escalation came 6 weeks after the funeral, when Mom's fall became the focal point. Revisionist history. Mom had fallen in her room at Willowbrook Tuesday evening in February, 3 months before her death. It was the kind of incident that happens frequently, despite the best precautions, because Alzheimer's patients often lose their sense of balance and spatial. The staff had called me immediately. Mom had been evaluated at the emergency room, and x-rays showed no broken bones, just bruising on her hip that healed within a few weeks. Tyler had somehow obtained a copy of the incident report and used it as evidence of negligent care. "A fall like this should never happen in a quality facility," he declared during a family conference call he'd demanded. The fact that Mom was alone in her room, that staff wasn't monitoring her closely enough to prevent this kind of accident, raises serious questions about the level of supervision she was receiving. I tried to explain that falls are unfortunately common among Alzheimer's patients, that the facility had protocols in place to minimize risks, but couldn't prevent every accident without restraining residents in ways that would truly compromise their dignity. I described how the staff had responded quickly, how Mom had received immediate medical attention, how the facility had adjusted her care plan afterward to include more frequent check-ins. Dylan supported Tyler's concerns with his own interpretation of events. "It seems like there might have been a communication breakdown," he said. "If Harper had been in closer contact with the staff, if there had been better coordination between family and caregivers, maybe this could have been prevented." The accusation that I wasn't in close enough contact with the staff was so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. I visited Mom 5 times a week, knew all her nurses by name, attended every care plan meeting, and had the facility's number programmed into my phone as an emergency contact. The nurses knew to call me about anything significant, and I'd built relationships with everyone from the activities coordinator to the night shift supervisor. But Tyler and Dylan's narrative required my involvement to be somehow inadequate, their distance to be justifiable, and Mom's decline to be preventable, if only I had made better choices. They began calling Willowbrook directly, demanding meetings with supervisors, requesting detailed explanations of their policies and procedures. The facility staff, trained to work with difficult family members, accommodated their sudden interest with professional courtesy, while privately expressing confusion to me about why my brothers were so concerned now when they'd been virtually absent for years. The financial pressure reached its breaking point during this period as well. Mom's funeral costs, her final medical bills, and the accumulated debt from 6 years of supplementing her care had left me financially devastated. I'd used credit cards to cover the gap between my income and her expenses, telling myself it was temporary, that somehow the situation would improve. But by the time she died, I owed $37,000 and had no savings left to rebuild my life. Meanwhile, Tyler posted photos from his family's spring break trip to Costa Rica, and Dylan's Instagram featured shots from a photography workshop in Iceland that cost more than I earned in 3 months. Neither seemed aware of the irony that they were critiquing the adequacy of care I'd provided while I was working 3 jobs to afford that care, and they were traveling internationally for pleasure. The most painful part of their blame campaign was how it infected my own memories of Mom's final years. During her last months, when the Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized me, she'd developed an obsession with finding something she called the box. She'd become agitated during visits, insisting that there was something important she needed to give me, something that would explain everything. The nurses assured me this was typical behavior for late-stage patients, who often fixated on completing imaginary tasks or retrieving non-existent objects. But Mom's agitation about the box felt different from her other confusion. She'd grab my hands with surprising strength, her eyes suddenly focused in a way they rarely were anymore, repeating over and over that I needed to find the box, that everything would make sense once I had it. When I'd ask her where the box was or what was in it, she'd become frustrated, unable to articulate what she meant, but clearly distressed by my inability to understand. Tyler and Dylan seized on these episodes as evidence that Mom had been trying to communicate something important that I'd failed to recognize or act upon. Maybe she was trying to tell you about documents, about wishes she hadn't expressed, Tyler suggested. If you'd pushed harder to understand what she meant, maybe we'd know more about what she really wanted for her final care. The suggestion that I hadn't tried hard enough to decode Mom's confused requests was devastating, because I'd spent countless hours attempting exactly that. I'd searched her apartment repeatedly for any box or container that might match her descriptions. I'd asked her doctors if there were ways to help patients communicate more clearly during lucid moments. I'd brought photo albums and personal items to her room, hoping they might trigger clearer memories about what she was trying to tell me. But Alzheimer's doesn't work that way. The disease creates false urgencies, phantom memories, imaginary tasks that feel desperately important to patients, but have no basis in reality. The medical literature was full of similar cases, families who exhausted themselves trying to fulfill impossible requests from loved ones whose brains were creating elaborate fictions about missing objects or unfinished business. As spring turned to summer, Tyler and Dylan's blame campaign evolved into a more formal critique of every decision I'd made during Mom's illness. They requested copies of her medical records, questioned her medication regimen, and second-guessed the timing of her move to memory care. They spoke with authority about treatments they'd never researched, facilities they'd never visited, and care philosophies they'd learned about from internet searches conducted months after Mom's death. The final straw came when Tyler suggested we should consider legal action against Willowbrook for the fall that had occurred in February. There might be grounds for a negligence claim, he said with the confidence of someone who'd never witnessed the day-to-day realities of Alzheimer's care. The fact that a patient in their care suffered an injury suggests inadequate supervision, and the facility's response might not have met the standard of care we should expect. I realized then that Tyler and Dylan weren't just rewriting history to ease their guilt about abandoning Mom during her illness. They were constructing a narrative where they could position themselves as the concerned sons who might have prevented her suffering if only I had involved them properly in her care. In their version of events, my attempts to handle everything alone had deprived them of the opportunity to be better sons, and Mom's death was the tragic result of my stubborn independence rather than their deliberate absence. The USB drive Mrs. Thorne had given me remained unwatched in my desk drawer, a final message from Mom that I wasn't ready to hear, while my brother's accusations echoed in my head. The decision to finally watch Mom's video came on a Thursday evening in August, 3 months after her death, when Tyler called to inform me that he'd retained a lawyer to investigate potential malpractice claims against Willowbrook Memory Care. "I've been consulting with a colleague who specializes in elder care litigation," he said, his voice carrying the professional authority he used when he wanted to end discussions before they started. "There are enough red flags in Mom's care records to warrant a formal review, and we think you should be prepared for some difficult questions about the decisions you made." The threat was clear, even wrapped in Tyler's careful legal language. If I didn't cooperate with their narrative that Mom had received inadequate care, they were prepared to make me a target of their lawsuit alongside the facility. The irony that Tyler was now threatening legal action against the place where I'd spent 6 years building relationships with staff who genuinely cared about Mom wasn't lost on me, but it clarified something important about where this blame campaign was heading. Dylan supported Tyler's legal threats with his own version of emotional manipulation. "We just want justice for Mom," he said during a 3-way call that felt more like an interrogation than a family discussion. "If there was negligence involved in her care, if corners were cut because of financial constraints or poor communication, don't we owe it to her memory to hold people accountable?" The suggestion that I might have chosen inadequate care because of financial constraints was particularly cruel, because both my brothers knew exactly how much I'd sacrificed financially to ensure Mom received the best possible treatment. They'd seen the bills, ignored the projections, and watched me work multiple jobs to bridge the gap between Mom's resources and her needs. Now they were suggesting that my financial limitations, created by their absence, had somehow compromised the quality of her care. I hung up on them and sat in my kitchen, staring at the USB drive I'd kept in my desk drawer for 3 months. Mrs. Thorne had said Mom recorded the message during her final weeks, during a lucid period when she'd specifically requested privacy to speak directly to me. The funeral director had seemed almost protective when she handed me the drive, emphasizing that Mom had been very clear about wanting me to watch it alone when I was ready to hear whatever she'd wanted to say. The video file was labeled simply, "For Harper," and dated March 15th, just 6 weeks before Mom's death. I recognized the background immediately. It was the small conference room at Willowbrook where families met with staff for care plan discussions. Mom was sitting in the chair she always preferred, the one closest to the window, wearing the blue cardigan I'd bought her for Christmas. Her hair was neatly styled, suggesting the staff had helped her prepare for this recording, and her expression was more focused than I'd seen it in months. "Harper, sweetheart," Mom began, her voice clearer than it had been during any of our recent visits. "I asked Mrs. Patterson to help me make this video because there are things I need you to know. Things I should have said years ago, but didn't have the courage to say while I was still myself." She paused, looking directly into the camera, with an intensity that reminded me of the mother I'd known, before Alzheimer's began stealing her away, piece by piece. "I know what your brothers have been doing," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I know they haven't been visiting, haven't been helping with my care, haven't been supporting you the way families should. During my good days, the nurses tell me things, and I remember more than people think I do. I know Tyler has visited 4 times in 6 years. I know Dylan calls you but never comes to see me. I know you've been carrying this burden alone, and I know it's been destroying your life." The validation I desperately needed for 6 years hit me like a physical force. Mom had seen everything, understood everything, even as her disease progressed. She'd been aware of my brother's abandonment and my sacrifices in ways that her confused requests about the box had never conveyed. Tears blurred my vision, but I couldn't pause the video, couldn't miss a word of what might be our final real conversation. "There's something else you need to know," Mom said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small key. "I've been hiding money, Harper. Not from you, but from your brothers. When your father died, he left instructions about what should happen if I became unable to manage my own affairs. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 447, and this key opens it. Inside, you'll find documents showing that Tyler has been stealing from my accounts." The revelation stopped my breathing entirely. Tyler, the successful lawyer who complained about Mom's care costs while posting photos from expensive vacations, had been stealing from her accounts while I worked 3 jobs to supplement her care expenses. The careful way he'd taken control of her estate after the funeral, his insistence on handling all financial matters, suddenly made horrifying sense. Mom continued, her voice now carrying an edge of anger I rarely heard from her even before the Alzheimer's. "Tyler has been transferring money from my investment accounts to his own for the past 3 years. Small amounts, spread out over time, probably thinking I wouldn't notice because of my condition, but I wasn't as confused as he thought during some of those bank visits he insisted on accompanying me to. The records are all in the safety deposit box, along with documentation of every penny you've spent on my care from your own salary." The scope of Tyler's betrayal was stunning. While I'd been liquidating my savings and working multiple jobs to afford Mom's care, he'd been systematically stealing from her accounts to fund his own lifestyle. While he'd been publicly questioning the adequacy of her treatment and privately threatening lawsuits about her care, he'd been committing financial elder abuse against the woman he claimed to be fighting for. "There's more in the box," Mom said, her expression growing sad. "Letters I wrote to both your brothers over the years, asking them to visit, begging them to help you with my care, explaining how much their absence was hurting both of us. Dylan saved every letter but never responded to any of them. Tyler's secretary apparently has instructions to return my mail unopened, marked addressee unknown, even though I was writing to his office address. The evidence of my brother's deliberate cruelty, their calculated decision to abandon not just me but Mom herself, was more systematic than I'd imagined. It wasn't just neglect or busy schedules or geographic distance. It was an intentional choice to cut themselves off from our family's crisis while positioning themselves to judge my handling of it. Mom leaned closer to the camera, her eyes filling with tears but her voice remaining steady. "I'm telling you this now because I won't be able to protect you much longer, and they're going to try to blame you for everything. They're going to say you didn't do enough, didn't include them properly, didn't make the right decisions. But Harper, sweetheart, you saved my life. Not just by managing my care, but by being the daughter who stayed, who visited, who held my hand during the scared times even when I didn't remember your name." The weight of 6 years of self-doubt began lifting as Mom continued. You gave up your engagement, your savings, your career opportunities, your social life, everything, to make sure I was safe and loved during the worst thing that ever happened to me. Tyler and Dylan abandoned us both, and they know it. And the only way they can live with themselves is by making you the villain in their story. Mom reached toward the camera as if she could touch me through the screen. Don't let them do that to you, Harper. Don't let them rewrite what really happened. You were the best daughter I could have asked for, and everything you did for me was exactly what I needed. The box contains enough evidence to show everyone the truth about who your brothers really are, but more importantly, it contains proof of who you are. The daughter who sacrificed everything to love me well. The video continued for several more minutes, with Mom sharing specific memories from our visits together, moments of connection that I'd treasured but wasn't sure she'd remembered. She spoke about the little things that had mattered most, the way I brought her favorite magazines, how I'd learned to braid her hair the way she liked it, the Sunday afternoons when we'd watch old movies together even when she couldn't follow the plots anymore. There's one more thing, Mom said as the video neared its end. Something I need you to understand about the box I kept asking you to find during my confused times. I wasn't talking about the safety deposit box with the documents. I was trying to tell you about a different box, a memory box I made for you years ago before I got sick. It's hidden in my bedroom closet, behind the photo albums on the top shelf. Inside, you'll find letters I wrote to you during your childhood, photos from when you were little, and a recording I made explaining why you were always my favorite, why you were the child who understood me best, why I knew you'd be the one to take care of me when I couldn't take care of myself anymore. The video ended with Mom looking directly into the camera one final time. I love you, Harper. I'm proud of you. And when Tyler and Dylan try to make you feel guilty about my death, I want you to remember that you gave me the most precious gift anyone can give, the certainty that I was loved and would never be abandoned. You were my hero, sweetheart. You always were. The screen went black, leaving me sobbing at my kitchen table with a clarity about my family that 6 years of gaslighting had obscured. Mom had seen everything, understood everything, and used her final lucid moments to give me the truth that Tyler and Dylan had been trying to steal from me. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with Mom's key and a copy of her death certificate, ready to discover the full extent of my brother's betrayal, and armed with the knowledge that the woman they claimed to be fighting for had spent her final weeks protecting me from their lies. The safety deposit box at First National Bank contained enough evidence to destroy my brother's reputations and potentially send Tyler to prison. Mrs. Henderson, the bank manager who accompanied me to the vault, maintained professional composure as I opened the long metal box, but I could see her shock as I began pulling out dozens of documents, bank statements, and copies of correspondence that painted a devastating picture of financial elder abuse and deliberate family abandonment. The bank statements showed Tyler's theft in meticulous detail. Starting 3 years ago, just after Mom's diagnosis became public knowledge in our family, he had been making monthly transfers from her investment accounts to his personal checking account. The amounts were carefully calculated to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, never more than $3,000 at a time, always spaced at least 2 weeks apart, always accompanied by forged authorizations bearing Mom's signature that became increasingly shaky as her condition worsened. Tyler had stolen $47,000 from Mom's accounts while I was working 3 jobs to supplement her care costs. $47,000 that could have paid for private nursing, experimental treatments, or simply relieved the crushing financial pressure that had destroyed my engagement and my savings. He'd been funding his family's lifestyle with money stolen from the woman whose care he was publicly criticizing as inadequate. The documentation Mrs. Henderson showed me revealed that Tyler had gained access to Mom's accounts by presenting himself as her primary caregiver and financial power of attorney, using letterhead from his law firm to create an aura of legitimacy with bank personnel who assumed a successful attorney would naturally be handling his mother's affairs. He'd even brought Mom to the bank twice during the early stages of her illness, coaching her to sign documents she didn't understand. She was confused and dependent on his guidance. But the financial theft, devastating as it was, wasn't the most damaging in the box. Mom had kept copies of every attempt she'd made to reach Tyler and Dylan during her illness, a heartbreaking archive of letters, emails, and documented phone calls that showed the systematic nature of their abandonment. The letters to Dylan were particularly cruel in their ignored desperation. "Dear Dylan," read one letter dated just 6 months after her diagnosis, "I know you're busy with your photography, but I'm scared about what's happening to me. The doctors say my memory will get worse, and Harper is trying to handle everything alone. Could you please visit soon? I want to talk to you while I still can." The letter was returned, unopened, stamped, Return to sender, no longer at this address, even though Dylan's Portland address hadn't changed and he'd been posting regularly on social media from that same location. Another letter, written a year later, was even more heartbreaking. Dylan, I don't understand why you won't answer my letters or return my calls. Harper tells me you're doing well, that your career is going wonderfully, and I'm so proud of you. But I'm disappearing a little more each day, and I need to see my son before I forget who you are completely. Please don't let me die without saying goodbye properly. Dylan had kept every letter Mom sent him, filing them chronologically in a folder marked Mom Filed, but never responding to a single one. The collection showed that Mom had written to him 23 times over 6 years, her handwriting becoming progressively more uncertain, her requests becoming more desperate, her expressions of love becoming more poignant as she sensed time running out. Tyler's correspondence was even more calculated. Rather than keeping Mom's letters, he'd instructed his secretary to return them unopened, creating a paper trail that would allow him to claim ignorance of her requests, while ensuring she received the clear message that her attempts at contact were unwelcome. The bank box contained copies of 17 letters Mom had sent to Tyler's office, all returned with official-looking stamps suggesting he'd moved or changed addresses, when in fact he'd been at the same law firm for 8 years. Most damaging was a recorded phone conversation Mom had somehow managed to preserve, a call she'd made to Tyler's office during one of her clearer periods about 2 years into her illness. I listened to the recording on my laptop right there in the bank vault, Mrs. Henderson discreetly stepping away to give me privacy as Mom's voice, stronger then than it would be later, pleaded with Tyler's secretary for just 5 minutes of her son's. Please tell him his mother called, Mom said on the recording, her voice breaking with emotion. Tell him I know I'm getting worse, but I'm not gone yet, and I need to. Tell him Harper is doing her best, but she's just one person, and this is too much for one person to handle alone. Tell him I love him and I'm proud of him, but I need him to be my son right now, not just someone who sends Christmas cards. Tyler's secretary's response was coldly professional. Mr. Reynolds is in court all day and won't be able to return personal calls. If this is regarding legal services, you can schedule a consultation through our website. This is his mother, Mom had replied, confusion creeping into her voice. I'm not trying to hire him. I'm his mother and I'm sick and I need to talk to my son. I understand, the secretary had said, her tone suggesting she didn't understand at all. But Mr. Reynolds has asked me to handle all family communications through official channels. If you have legal documents that need review, we can schedule an appointment. The conversation ended with Mom crying softly, asking if the secretary would at least tell Tyler that his mother had called, that she missed him, that she was afraid of forgetting who he was before she could say goodbye. The secretary promised to pass along the message, but the bank records showed that Tyler's next withdrawal from Mom's accounts occurred just 3 days later. The evidence folder also contained detailed financial records that I'd kept meticulously over 6 years, documenting every penny I'd contributed to Mom's care from my teacher's salary. Mom had somehow obtained copies of my bank statement, showing the progression of my financial sacrifice as I liquidated maxed out credit cards and took on additional work to bridge the gap between her resources. She'd calculated that I'd spent $63,000 of my own money on her care, plus untold amounts in lost income, the career opportunities I'd declined to maintain my availability for her appointments and crises. The documentation showed that while Tyler was stealing money from, I was contributing from my own, but the most emotionally devastating medical. A notebook she'd kept during her clearer periods, documenting her awareness of the family dynamics around her illness. Her entries revealed that she'd been far more cognizant of Tyler and Dylan's abandonment than any of us had realized, that she'd understood the burden I was carrying alone, and that she'd been deliberately protecting me from additional stress by not expressing her full awareness of the situation. Harper thinks I don't notice how tired she looks, read one entry from 3 years ago. But I see everything. She's working herself to death trying to take care of me, and her brothers act like I'm already dead. Tyler visited today for 20 minutes, spent the whole time on his phone and left without saying goodbye. I pretended to be more confused than I was because I didn't want him to see how much it hurt. Another entry, written just months before her death, was even more revealing. Harper doesn't know that I can still understand most of what's happening around me. The nurses think I'm gone. Tyler and Dylan think I'm gone, but I'm still here inside this failing brain, and I see how much Harper has given up for me. She doesn't even know that I know about David leaving her, about the jobs she's turned down, about the credit card bills she thinks I can't see. My beautiful daughter is destroying her own life to save what's left of mine. The final document in the safety deposit box was Mom's real will, dated just 6 months before her death, leaving everything to me with a detailed explanation of her reasoning. Harper has been my only real family during this illness, the will stated. While my sons chose their careers and their comfort over their mother's needs, Harper chose love over everything else. She deserves to inherit the life I can no longer live, and she deserves to be free from the financial burden she's carried alone for so long. Mrs. Henderson helped me copy everything, ensuring I had complete documentation of Tyler's theft, Dylan's deliberate abandonment, and Mom's true assessment of our family dynamics during her illness. As I prepared to leave the bank, she quietly mentioned that the institution's fraud prevention team would need to be notified about Tyler's unauthorized access to Mom's accounts, and that the evidence I'd discovered would likely trigger both criminal and civil investigation. That evening, I called Tyler and Dylan, requesting an emergency family meeting to discuss some documents I'd found among Mom's effects. Neither asked what I'd discovered, both assuming I'd found something that would support their narrative about inadequate care or institutional negligence. Tyler suggested we meet at Mom's apartment, the same location where they'd first accused me of keeping them at arm's length from her care decisions. As I prepared for the confrontation that would finally expose my brother's 6 years of lies and theft, I found myself thinking about Mom's video message, her insistence that I shouldn't let them rewrite what had really happened during her illness. Armed with her documentation and her explicit support for my decisions, I was finally ready to stop defending myself against their accusations and start holding them accountable for their own choices. The folder full of evidence sat on my passenger seat as I drove to Mom's apartment. Proof that the daughter they'd blamed for everything had actually been the only family member who'd chosen love over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness, presence over profit. Tomorrow, Tyler and Dylan would learn that their mother had been watching everything, documenting everything, and protecting me from their lies even as her mind failed her. But tonight, I needed to retrieve the memory box Mom had mentioned in her video, the collection of letters and recordings she'd hidden in her closet, the final gift from a mother who'd used her last clear moments to ensure her devoted daughter would never doubt her worth again. The memory box was exactly where Mom said it would be, hidden behind photo albums on the top shelf of her bedroom closet in a space so carefully concealed that I'd missed it during dozens of visits over the past 3 years. It was a simple wooden jewelry box, the kind with multiple compartments and a small mirror inside the lid, but it had been transformed into a treasure chest of our relationship that Mom had been curating since I was a child. Inside, I found letters she'd written to me over the years but never sent, documents that revealed she'd been watching my sacrifices and my struggles with a clarity that her illness had hidden from everyone, including me. The earliest letters dated back to my teenage years, when she'd apparently sensed that I was being treated differently by the family, that I was being positioned as the responsible one, while Tyler and Dylan were excused from emotional labor because of their gender and their career ambitions. My dearest Harper, read one letter from when I was 16. I know your father and I expect more from you than we do from your brothers, and I know that isn't fair. But you have a strength and a kindness that they don't possess, and people are drawn to your caring nature. I worry that we're teaching you to give more than you receive, and I want you to know that your value isn't measured by how much you sacrifice for others. The prescience of that observation, written 12 years before her Alzheimer's diagnosis, showed that Mom had recognized the family dynamics that would eventually leave me alone with her care, while Tyler and Dylan pursued their own interests. She'd seen the pattern developing and had tried, in her way, to prepare me for the burden that would inevitably fall on my shoulders. The final recording in the memory box was 43 minutes long, made just 2 weeks before her death during what must have been her last extended lucid period. Mom's voice was weak but determined as she explained the full scope of what she'd discovered about Tyler's financial abuse and Dylan's calculated emotional abandonment. Harper, by the time you hear this, Tyler will probably be planning legal action against Willowbrook or against you directly, Mom said in the recording. He needs someone else to blame for my death because accepting responsibility would mean acknowledging that he stole from his dying mother, while his sister worked 3 jobs to pay for care he should have been providing. She'd apparently convinced a night nurse to help her access Tyler's financial power of attorney documents, and what she'd discovered was worse than the bank records had revealed. Tyler hadn't just been stealing money from her accounts. He'd been systematically underreporting her assets to Medicaid, claiming she had fewer resources than she actually possessed, so that government assistance would cover her care costs while he continued draining her private accounts. The Medicaid fraud alone could send him to prison, Mom said in the recording, her voice carrying a hardness I'd never heard before. But more than that, Harper, it proves that he knew exactly how much money was available for my care. He knew he could have afforded private nurses, specialized treatments, anything that might have helped me. Instead, he chose to steal that money while watching you destroy your own financial future, trying to give me what he could have provided easily. The recording continued with Mom's detailed observations about Dylan's behavior during his rare phone calls, conversations I hadn't been privy to but that she'd apparently been lucid enough to analyze and remember. Dylan's calls, she revealed, weren't expressions of concern, but fishing expeditions designed to gather information he could later use to critique my decisions without having to involve himself in actual caregiving. Dylan would call and ask very specific questions about your choices, Mom explained. What medications was I taking? Why had you chosen Willowbrook over other facilities? Whether you'd gotten second opinions about my treatment. But when I tried to tell him how much I missed him, how much I wanted him to visit, he'd change the subject or end the call. He was collecting ammunition, not maintaining a relationship. The evidence Mom had gathered painted a picture of two sons who had conspired, perhaps unconsciously, to abandon their mother while positioning themselves to blame their sister for the consequences of that abandonment. They'd created a narrative where my willingness to handle everything meant they were justified in handling nothing, where my competence relieved them of responsibility, where my sacrifices proved they weren't needed. The family meeting I'd called for the next evening took place in Mom's living room, surrounded by the same photographs and memories that had witnessed Tyler's accusation or the funeral. But this time, I arrived with documentation that would permanently alter the power dynamic between us. Tyler brought a legal pad and his confident courtroom. Dylan carried a leather portfolio and his artist's sensitivity to emotional nuance. Both seemed prepared for another session of questioning my decisions and establishing their moral authority over our family's tragedy. I started by placing the bank statement. The documents that showed Tyler theft spread out chronologically, so the pattern. Tyler's expression changed immediately, confident authority to panicked damage control, as he recognized his own account, his own crime documented. Where did you get these? He demanded, his lawyer instincts kicking in as his face drained. These are private financial documents. You had no right to my banking. These aren't your banking records, I replied. These are Mom's banking, showing unauthorized transfers to your accounts. She kept copies of everything because she knew what you were doing even when she seemed confused about everything else. Dylan leaned forward to examine the documents, his artistic eye quickly grasping the visual pattern of theft that the statements revealed. Tyler, what is this? He asked, his voice uncertain. These show money coming from Mom's accounts into yours. Did she ask you to manage her finances? Tyler's response revealed the depth of his panic and the weakness of his legal position. Mom was confused about money, he said quickly. She asked me to help her with transfers, to make sure her bills were being paid. I was protecting her assets from poor financial decisions. I pulled out the recorded phone conversation, the one where Mom had begged Tyler's secretary for 5 minutes of her son's time while Tyler was stealing from her accounts just days later. Let me play you something, I said, connecting my laptop to Mom's television. This is Mom calling your office 2 years ago, trying to reach her son who was supposedly protecting her. The recording played in the silent living room, Mom's voice filling the space with her desperate attempts to connect with Tyler, while his secretary dismissed her as just another caller seeking legal services. Dylan's face crumpled as he heard our mother's confusion and pain, her growing realization that her successful lawyer son was treating her like a stranger who was interrupting his important work. She called me Mom, Dylan whispered when the recording ended. She was calling herself Mom to your secretary because your staff didn't know who she was. Tyler's defense collapsed into victim blaming and justification. She was getting confused about money, making poor decisions about her care. Someone had to take control before she spent everything on expensive treatments that wouldn't work. I was preserving her assets for all of us. You were stealing from her while I used my own money to pay for her care, I said, pulling out my own financial records that Mom had somehow obtained and preserved. These show that I contributed $63,000 of my own salary to Mom's expenses while you were stealing $47,000 from her accounts. You weren't preserving assets, Tyler. You were stealing money that could have paid for the private care you now claim she should have received. The evidence of Dylan's systematic emotional abandonment was equally devastating. I played portions of Mom's final recording where she described his information-gathering phone calls, his refusal to respond to her letters, his calculated decision to maintain enough contact to stay informed, but not enough to actually help. Dylan, she wrote to you 23 times, I said, showing him the returned letters Mom had kept. 23 letters over 6 years, begging you to visit, asking you to help me with her care, telling you she was scared and needed her family. You kept every letter she sent, but never responded to any of them. Dylan's artistic sensitivity, always his shield against difficult emotions, finally cracked under the weight of documented evidence. I thought Harper had everything under control, he said weakly. I thought Mom was getting good care, that she was happy at the facility. I didn't know she was writing letters. You knew, I replied, showing him the postal receipts that proved delivery. You kept the letters. You filed them chronologically. You documented her deterioration through her handwriting and her increasing desperation, but you never responded because responding would have meant accepting responsibility. The final piece of evidence was Mom's real will, the document that left everything to me with her detailed explanation of why Tyler and Dylan had forfeited their inheritance through their abandonment and abuse. Tyler's face went white as he read Mom's assessment of his character, her explicit statement that he'd chosen money over family, that he'd proven himself unworthy of her legacy. "This will can be contested," Tyler said, falling back on legal technicalities when moral arguments failed him. Mom wasn't competent to make major financial decisions during her illness. Any documents signed after her diagnosis can be challenged in court. "The will was signed 6 months before her death," I replied, "and her doctor certified her competency for legal decisions. But more importantly, Tyler, contesting this will mean exposing your theft to a probate court. It means criminal investigation of your financial elder abuse. It means your law license, your career, your reputation, everything you stole money to protect." The room fell silent as the full implications of their situation became clear. Tyler could challenge the will, but doing so would trigger the criminal investigation that the bank had already begun based on the evidence I'd provided. Dylan could claim ignorance of Mom's letters, but his own organized filing system proved his awareness of her attempts to reach him. "What do you want?" Tyler asked finally, his legal mind recognizing a negotiation when he saw one. "I want you to stop lying about what happened during Mom's illness," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that you abandoned her, that you stole from her, that you blamed me for the consequences of your own choices. I want you to understand that she died knowing exactly who her real family was." The meeting ended with Tyler and Dylan's complete capitulation to the truth Mom had preserved for me. They couldn't deny the documented evidence of their abandonment and abuse, couldn't rewrite the history that Mom had carefully recorded, couldn't maintain their narrative of concerned sons betrayed by an inadequate daughter. 3 months later, I used Mom's inheritance to establish the Linda Morrison Foundation for Alzheimer's Family Support, providing financial assistance and respite care for family caregivers who find themselves alone with impossible burdens. The foundation's first grant went to upgrade the activities room at Willowbrook Memory Care, where Mom had spent her final years surrounded by staff who genuinely cared about her well-being. Tyler's law license was suspended pending investigation of his financial elder abuse, though he avoided criminal prosecution by agreeing to pay full restitution plus penalties. Dylan moved back to Chicago, claiming he wanted to be closer to family, but we have no relationship beyond the legal necessities of settling Mom's estate. The most important discovery was that Mom's love for me had been complete and unconditional, that she'd seen my sacrifices and honored them, that she'd used her final clarity to ensure I would never doubt my worth or my choices. The daughter who'd been blamed for everything had actually been. The daughter who'd saved everything that could be saved, who'd given love when love was all that remained to give. Sometimes being abandoned by those who should love you most leads you to discover that the love you gave in return was more valuable than anything they ever offered. Sometimes the family that blames you for their failures is simply proving that you were strong enough to carry what they were too weak to lift. If you've ever been the family member who sacrificed everything only to be blamed for not doing enough, I want you to know that the people who abandon responsibility will always try to make their abandonment your fault. But the truth has a way of preserving itself, just like my mother preserved it for me, waiting for the right moment to set the record straight. Don't forget to subscribe if this story resonated with you, and remember that the love you give is never wasted, even when it isn't returned. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the certain knowledge that you loved well when loving was hard.